ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ትችላላችሁ።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ ጥያቄና መልስ የክፍል ስራዎች ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁት አይነት በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ ከናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
Okay, good afternoon, students. Now we can start the teaching learning process. As you remember, in the last session, we have seen a lot of concepts. We have seen the first chapter. Under this, we have seen the basic concepts of logic, the nature and the meaning of philosophy. We have also seen the major or the core branches of philosophy, and beside we have seen the importance of learning philosophy. Today we begin chapter 2. As you see from the slides, chapter 2 is all about basic concepts of logic. Okay, students, please, before we directly start the chapter, make it your image appear to the screen. Please, I want to see your face, so that make it your image to appear on the screen for the instructor. Okay, under this chapter, we will see two basic lessons. The first lesson is all about the basic concepts of logic. In this lesson, we will see the arguments, the premises, and conclusion. In the second lesson, we will see the different techniques of identifying argumentative passages from non-argumentative passages. So now let's give you an introduction about the basic notion of logic and basic concepts related with logic. As I have told you in the last session, logic is one branch of philosophy which studies about reasoning process. It's all about argument. So logic can be also defined as the organized body of knowledge or science that evaluates argument. In logic, in understanding logic, in defining logic, we must be able to understand the arguments in general. Because without understanding of what arguments is, we cannot able to understand what logic is. Because logic is an organized body of knowledge, or it's a science that studies about arguments in general. The basic objective or aim of logic as a science or as a body of knowledge is to develop those well-studied method, principles, and standards that we may use as reference, as a criteria for evaluating the arguments of others, and it helps us to guide in constructing the argument of ours. So here you can understand the basic objective or the aim of logic is to develop a systematic, a well-studied scientific methods and principles, not only for constructing the argument of ours, but also for evaluating the argument of others that we have encountered in our daily life. So argument is a systematic. We have said that logic is the science of argument. So now let's see what argument is. Argument is a systematic combination of two or more statements. These statements can be classified as a premise and a conclusion. Here we can understand that within an argument we have a sentence, a statement, not a sentence. That statement contains both a premise or a premises and a conclusion, a single conclusion. So argument is a combination of this premise and conclusion as a component or body of the argument. This is a preliminary concept for understanding the next basic concepts of logic. From here, from the argument, you can understand that premise, what premises is. Premises is a statement which give us an evidence or support. It's a claim. We can refer this as a claim or a support or an evidence that help us to make our argument logical to the main part of the argument, that is that we call it conclusion. Therefore, a premises is a claim or something within the statement that gives us an evidence or a support or a claim for the thing that we wanted to infer, that we call it a conclusion. On the other hand, conclusion can be understood. It belongs with the statement. It's a part of the statement that comes from the premise. Or it can be understood as a claim that follows from the alleged evidence. So that our premises or the premise give us the support for this conclusion. The conclusion is directly stemmed from, or it flow from the alleged evidence what we have from the premises. So here you can understand that an argument must contain a statement that contains the premise and the conclusion. Therefore, depending on the logical and reliability of the premise to support the conclusion and the argument, that can be is a good argument or bad argument, which means if our premise or premises provide or gives a support or an evidence to the conclusion in such a way that the premises is give us an evidence for the conclusion that we wanted to inform. If that is so, our argument is good. This the case in point on the contrary, which means if our premise does not give us a support or an evidence to the conclusion, still that is an argument, but that argument is the bad argument. So here you can understand that the logical and the real ability of the premise conclusion determines the goodness of the argument and the badness of the argument. Arguments, depending on their nature, depending on the inferential link between the premises and the conclusion, arguments can be classified or categorized or divided into deductive and inductive arguments. An argument is said to be a deductive argument if and only if the premises that we claimed or the premise that supports the conclusion in such a way that if it is impossible for the conclusion to be false and the premises to be true, we call it, this is a kind of deductive argument. So in the case of deductive argument, there is a necessity clause. The evidence that we have at our hand is very certain. We are sure of that the conclusion not to be the false if we have true premises, because the claims or the evidences that we have in hand are certainly known by us. So totally we can say it is impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. If this is the case, the types of argument is, we call it deductive argument. On the other hand, if an argument contains a premises that are claimed to support the conclusion in such a way that it is improbable that the premise to be true and the conclusion is false. What is different from the deductive argument here in the case of an inductive argument is that it is based on the relationship between the premises and the conclusion is not based on certainty or impossibility of the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. Rather, it is based on improbable. This means that the evidences that we have, or which means the premises that we claimed to support the conclusion, are not totally or completely certain. Probably they may be, at the same time, probably they may not be. There might be the case of chance. We cannot be certain about the conclusion based on the relationship between the premises and the inference that we wanted to make. So a deductive argument provides, this means that a deductive argument provides all the necessary support needed to arrive at this conclusion. Which means, in the case of deductive argument, where we can certainly say about the conclusion because we have the evidences, the claims, or the supports which help us for inferring. Whereas in the case of inductive argument, we don't have a complete control, or we don't have a complete evidence. So our inference is depending on probability, not certainty. when we see the evaluation of the two types of arguments, the deductive and the inductive argument, a deductive argument can be evaluated through validity and soundness based on the relationship between the components of the argument, that is the premises and the conclusion, or on the other hand, depending on the factual claim and the inferential. Whereas in the case of inductive argument, we can evaluate it by its strengths and its causality. These are the terminologies that we can apply in evaluating these two types of arguments. So depending on its actual ability to successfully maintain its inferential claim, a deductive argument can be either valid or invalid. But still they are an argument. What makes valid and invalid is the strength or the link of the premise and the conclusion. We'll see this in evaluating arguments later. If the premise of a certain deductive argument actually supports its conclusion in such a way that it is impossible for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false, then that particular deductive is valid. So we can say that a valid deductive argument is an argument that contains a support or an evidence in such a way that if we have a premise that is true and that we are certain that the conclusion cannot be false, or it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. In this case, we can say that this deductive argument is a valid deductive argument. We will look at examples later. On the other hand, if its premises actually support its conclusion in such a way that it's possible the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false, then the particular deductive argument is invalid. We'll look at the possibilities in evaluating any arguments. We may have four possibilities. The premise can be true in both cases, and the premise at the same time can be false, which means we may have a true premise and a true conclusion. We may have a true premises and a false conclusion. We may have a true premises and false conclusion. In this case, necessarily it is invalid. We may have also the possibility of to be the premise false and the conclusion true. And we may have the possibility of the premise to be false and at the same time the conclusion to be false. Except the second possibility, that is in the case where the premise is true and the conclusion false. In the other case, when evaluating that argument, they can be both valid and invalid. We'll see this, how it could appear. So in the case where the premises is true and it is possible, if it is possible for the conclusion to be false, typically this is an invalid deductive argument. Similarly, not only in the case of deductive, similarly in the case of inductive argument, It can be either strong or weak, depending on, again, the ability, the actual ability to successfully maintain its inferential claim. Here, inferential claim refers to the logical reasoning process between the premise and the conclusion. The most important thing that we need to be aware of is that the inferential claim or the inferential link. In every argument, there are two clauses, that is, the factual and the inferential. The factual clause is a clause that gives us the facts or the truth value of that statement, whereas the inferential claims give us the link, the reasoning process of the premises and the conclusion. If the premises of a certain inductive argument is actually supported in conclusion in some ways that it is improbable for the conclusion. Here you need to bear in mind the term improbable, not impossible. Are you looking here on the screen that I have shared for you? Improbable. This is very key terminology for understanding the inductive argument. Not on possibility, it's improbable. Improbability for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false. Then this is typically an example of a strong inductive argument. On the contrary, or on the other side, if we have a premises that actually support the conclusion, the point that we wanted to infer in such a way that is probable, so for the premise to be true and the conclusion to be false, then it is typically an example of a weak inductive argument. But don't forget that these cases also, there are types of argument. Still, they are an argument, but based on their actual ability that to successfully maintain it is inferential claim. They can be both strong, at the same time they can be weak, depending on the inferential claim between the premises and the conclusion. Now, let us see the meaning of logic in detail. I think you have a preliminary understanding of the concept of what logic is. Having that preliminary knowledge, let's look at in depth what logic is. Of course, the most problematic thing in social science is that there is no one single working definition of terms and words in social science, which means we cannot clearly have a working definition of what logic is. So we cannot bring a kind of definition which is acceptable to all, for the meaning of what logic. But we can look at the different definition forwarded by logicians and other academicians. So let us see the different definition of logic which are forwarded by scholars, writers, and logicians. The first thing is that the word logic comes from Greek, because, as I have told you, philosophers use logic as their primary inquiry to philosophize on issues. So logics comes from the Greek word which means sentence, discourse, reason, truth, and rule. This is the epistemological or the literary definition of logic. This is the literal, the etymological definition of what logic is. That's a Greek word which comes from the Greek, and its meaning is truth, rule, discourse, reason, and sentence. Another definition, and it's a broader one, is that logic, the broader meaning is a science which evaluates argument and the study of correct reasoning. We have said that it's a science, it's a systematic body of knowledge which applies rigorous scientific process for evaluating arguments. A one who is use of the concept of logic may evaluate the argument of his own and as a criteria for looking the argument of others through applying scientific and well-studied methods and principles. So the broader meaning of logic is it's a science. It's a science that evaluates arguments, and it is a study of correct reasoning. The other differentiation is that logic can be also defined as it's a study of as a study of method and principles and correct or the art of correct reasoning. As a result of this, some logicians say that we can interchangeably use the word logic and theory of correct reasoning as the same. In correct reasoning, we need to have kinds of methods, principles, and standards, which are priorly set, which help us as a guide or as a criteria to lead our way of argument in a correct reasoning process. So we can understand logic that it's the art of correct reasoning. The other definition of logic is that logic is an attempt to codify the rule of rational thought. This is a little bit similar with the above definition of logic. And in addition, logic is one of the primary tools that philosophers use their inquiry. As I have said in the last session, before logic comes to as a field of study, philosophers use reasoning process or logic as their fundamental inquiry. They develop their own questions for issues and ideas by applying the principles of or the tools of logic. So we can also understand logic as it's a tool for philosophers for inquiry for issues that they want to deal. These are some of the suggested definition of what logic is. Now let us see the importance or the benefits of studying logic. What benefit you students, you learners, the course logic? What helps for you? Of course, there should not be a kind of imposed benefit for you. As I have told you, it depends on the one who defined it. The benefits that will bring someone may not be the case in point for another person. Even if we are asking different learners from different discipline, they give us a kind of different answer based on the perspectives they are learning. So we cannot impose the benefit to someone else. What benefit him studying logic? But there is one important benefit of studying logic, which is suggested or stated by Lehman, which is logic sharpen and refine our natural gift to think, reason, and argue. This is the most and the magnificent benefit of studying logic, which means, as we all know, in our day-to-day moment, we have a communication with others. So knowingly or unknowingly, we apply logic. We apply reasoning process. We apply arguments. Some individuals by nature endowed or gifted a kind of ability to construct an argument which is correct, logically correct. On the contrary, there are also individuals who are not gifted, but they can develop, they can improve their skill of reasoning out issues and constructing arguments. So, knowingly or unknowingly, if we are entering arguments in our daily life, we are reflecting our thinking, what we feel, simply our gut feeling. And we may well reason out our ideas, our arguments. As I have said, this might be a matter of natural gift, but it can be also improved. It can be sharpened through practice and through getting education. Because there are skills that can be learned through formal education. So logic, studying logic as a field of study can sharpen our nature of thinking, reasoning out, and arguing with others.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ MBA በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት MBA በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ MBA በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ MBA በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ MSc በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
So other listed benefits. The first one is logic. Studying logic can help us to develop the skill needed to construct a sound or good and fallacy-free argument of one's own and evaluate the argument of others. Because we have said that logic is the study of arguments, right reasoning. If we are well acquainted with reasoning in arguments, this simply refers to we can easily develop the skill that helps us for constructing a kind of argument that is free of defection and pretend, or without committing a kind of fallacy between the premises and the conclusion. So simply, learning logic can benefit us for constructing a kind of strong or good argument which is free of fallacy, and which helps us to easily identify the fallacies that is easily committed on others in evaluating the argument of our counterparts, if there is any, who is discussing with us. The second benefit of studying logic is that studying logic can benefit us, provide a fundamental defense against the prejudiced and uncivilized attitudes that are threatening the foundation of civilized and democratic society. Of course, it is very difficult to say that people are illiterate and uneducated. It's very, very tricky. And it's not good to say people are illiterate and uneducated. Because education is not only acquired through formal education. There's also a kind of education through informal. Education from our life, education from our living environment. But for those who do not have a clue or an understanding of logic, they exercise a kind of prejudiced suggestion and thoughts, which is basically very catastrophic for the prosperity of a nation or a state and to progress the society as a whole. So studying logic gives us as a defense for those who are in a position of reflecting those prejudiced and uncivilized attitudes like stereotyping, defamation, hearsay, expressing hearsay opinion, being close-mindedness, intolerant. For those attitudes, studying logic can help us fundamentally stand against those prejudiced and uncivilized attitudes. So this is also the major benefit of studying logic. The other benefit is that it helps us to distinguish a good argument from bad argument. Because we have said that the goodness and the badness of the argument is depending on the link that is formed between the premises and the conclusion in a given argument. So the well understanding of this argument means we're applying the principles and methods of logic. If we are applying these methods and principles, we are in a position for distinguishing those good arguments from bad arguments. So don't underestimate the benefit of learning or studying logic. It has a paramount benefit. The other benefit is that it helps us to understand and identify the common illogical errors in reasoning. We have said there are errors, there are defects, there are pretension in constructing arguments. And individuals may give us a kind of false reason or may give us an evidence which is false. It might be, but necessarily it might be sufficient, depending on the support or the claims that the individual's insights for us or give for us. So there are individuals who are necessarily committing a fallacy or they use a false reasoning by only pretending, by only gives you a kind of defect or by forming a kind of both formal and informal fallacy. We'll study in the chapter 5 under fallacy and logic. These fallacies can be based on relevance, the relevance of the premise of the conclusion. It might be based on the presumption and the weakened action. It can be also based on the grammar and the weakened action. So a well understanding of what logic and logical reasoning can help us for identifying or understanding those errors, those defects, those false reasoning processes which are occurred within the argument. The other benefit is that it helps us to understand and identify common confusion that often are due to misuse of language. We'll look at in chapter 3 in philosophy of language. There are words, there are terminologies, there are expressions which are confusing. At the same time, there are also expressions which are ambiguous. So, an individual may let us for wrongly or misunderstand an argument by applying or by adding confusion, terms which lead us confusion. But well understanding of logic can help us for identifying those confusions and ambiguities because of the misuse of language. The other and the last benefit of, but not the least benefit of studying logic for this lesson is that it enables us to disclose ill-conceived policies in political sphere. To be careful of discuss and to distinguish the rational from irrational, sun from the intern, and so on. I think you are well aware of that. In politics, there are elections, there are political parties. These political parties, during election campaign, they may tell us their ideologies. Some of them can be able to put into practice. They may be attainable and practical. but the other are very comprehensive and they may be very tricky or difficult to put into practice on the ground. They remain only as promises on the sphere. There are also policies which are by the very outset ill-conceived. So logic can help us for understanding those irrational, sun and intern. The correct political ideologies from incorrect, which means the chance of the attainability of the ideology they are climbing. I think this is enough for this part, the benefit of studying logic. You have a scheduling question here that you can easily look from the screen. Okay, first, I think it's better to finish the session and you will have a time for discussing this question. So it's better to move to the next session. Now let us look at what is argument. Because we have said that in understanding logic, argument is the central or the pillars of argument. Without having a notion of argument, we are not able to say anything about logic. So it's better to understand what is an argument. I think you have a preliminary understanding from your previous background or from our previous discussion, from our last discussion. So argument, it can be defined differently in different perspectives, but our definition is on the perspective of logic. Logic in an argument in logic. So its definition is very technical and very specific, which concerned with logic. So it's a statement or one or more of which a premise are claimed to provide support for the reason to believe one of them the conclusion. As you have said, argument is a statement. It must be a statement. From the very outset, it must be a statement. What is a statement? A statement is a kind of declarative sentence, not any forms of sentence. There are sentences like exclamation, suggestion, command, and also there are plans. Of course, they are sentences, but they are not statements. So an argument is a statement. A statement here means it's a declarative statement, which contains a premises and a conclusion. When we see the content of the premise and the conclusion, that statement must contain a declarative, which means it must have a kind of truth value. The truth value of the statement can be true, at the same time it can be false, but it must contain a truth value, no matter how its falsity and its truthfulness. But it must be declarative, which means it must contain a truth value. For example, if I say, let's study, or if I recommend you to study logic once within a day, it's a sentence, of course, but it does not contain a truth value. You cannot say that it is true or false. If I say you have to study logic per day, if I say this statement is this sentence is not a statement, because you cannot say this sentence as true or false. So a statement must be a declarative. From the very outset, it must be a declarative. Don't be confused. If it is not declarative, or if it does not contain a truth value, which can be true or false, generally it is not a statement, and we cannot deal about arguments. Within this statement, we may have a single premise, where we may have more than one premises and a single conclusions. Let me give you here an example for understanding what argument or what a statement is, because it's very basic. If I say that National Aviation College is the best college, private college in Ethiopia, you can't say this statement as true or false. Really, it has a truth value. It can be false or true. You may say it's true, it's best. It's number one, you may say. If this is a statement, because it has truth value. There must be two conditions. I have told you the first condition, that is, it must contain, or it must have a group of statements. The statements may contain the premise and the conclusion, and it must be declarative. It must be declarative. The second is that a statement that makes up an argument that divides into premise and the conclusion. Only if the statement is only contains, or if there are only a premises, which means missing of the conclusion that we wanted to infer, still they are not argument. They are a statement, of course, but they are not an argument. Therefore, these two conditions must be simultaneously occur in order to say there is an argument. Let us look, as you look here, the example. All Ethiopians are African. This is the first premises. The factual claim here, or the fact, can be true or false. It contains a truth value. It's simply it is a statement. It contains a statement. Here is also another premise, the second premises. Sionoid is an Ethiopian. Here also the factual claim or the truth value can be true or false. But whatever it is true or false, it is a statement, because we can say it is true or false. From the first two premises, we can conclude, therefore, Sionoid is an African. This is the conclusion. It contains a single conclusion and two premises. Here it fulfills the requirements of what an argument is, which means we have the premises, two premises and one conclusion. At the same time, the premise and the conclusion are statements. They are statements. So we can say we have constructed an argument. But if this statement lacks one requirement, which means if one of the premises lacks, or if it does not contain the truth value, this premise is not in a position, or it does not give us a claim or a support for the conclusion. But because we have said first, it must be a statement. This is what an argument is. this argument can be, as I have told you, it can be good, well supported. At the same time, it can be poorly supported argument. For example, if we see the first example, that is, all Ethiopians are African, the first premises, and so now it is an Ethiopian, and therefore Tionah is an African. It's a kind of argument which is well supported, because we have these two premises or claims or supporters that help us for the alleged evidence that we wanted to follow, that's the conclusion or the inference. Having these two premises, we can conclude that Tionah is an African, because if all Ethiopians are African, and if Tionah is an Ethiopian, certainly or deductively, we can say that Tionah is an African. It is a well-supported deductive argument. On the other hand, you can look at here the bad supported argument. Some Africans are black. This is the first premises. And the second premises is Zelalem is an African. Therefore, Zelalem is black, the conclusion. Of course, here is the word some. Here is the word some. Some Africans are black. Unfortunately, Zelalem maybe belongs to among the some Africans. At the same time, he may not also be on the part of those some Africans, which means these two provided supporters or claims or premises or factual claims are not provide us well support evidence. So that this is typically an example of I think a bad or poorly supported argument. Zelalem is the black. He may or may not be, but still it's an argument. Okay? It's still an argument. I think you have a better understanding of what argument and the parts of argument and the how argument is formed. We have said argument must be a declarative statement, must contain a statement, a group of statements, which is a declarative, that is, it must contain a truth value, and at the same time, these parts of the statement must be able to categorize as a premise and a conclusion. Commands, reports, declaration, exclamation, questions, even questions are not arguments, because they don't have truth value. Now let us see how we can able to distinguish or able to separate premises from the conclusion. Distinguish premises from the conclusion and distinguish conclusion from the premise, the vice versa. Sometimes, as you can here, look at here, sometimes identifying a conclusion from the premise is very tough, because that argument may not contain indicator words, and it might not be well show, it may not adequately tell us or show us the link between the claim, the factual claim, and the inferential claim. The premise and the conclusion are difficult to identify for a number of reasons. Since it is impossible to analyze the argument without identifying a conclusion from the premises, we need techniques that can help us to identify the premise from the conclusion and vice versa. The first technique that helps us for identifying or distinguishing a premises from the conclusion is that looking at the indicator words. Frequently, in most cases, most often, an argument contains certain indicators, words that provide a clue or a hint in identifying the premises and the conclusion. Let's see these indicators. We have taken that indicator words are a means, or they help us out for distinguishing or separating the conclusion from the premises and the vice versa. Let us look at those indicator words which show us or which tell us the conclusion. We call them the conclusion indicators. For example, if there are words, that is, therefore, accordingly, provided that it must be, we may conclude, hence it shows that, thus, consequently, it implies that as a result, so and so on, it is a conclusion. The part of that argument is a conclusion. The statement that comes after these indicator words is a conclusion. A statement that comes after the indicator, the conclusion indicator word is a conclusion. An argument that contains any of the conclusion indicator words which are listed above, the trends that follow the indicator words can usually be identified as the conclusion. I've said this one. By the process of elimination, if we are able to identify by looking at the indicator words of the conclusion, by the rule of elimination, the remaining parts of the argument is a premises. Because we have a single conclusion, but we may have one or more premises. So if we are able to identify that, that is the conclusion, the remaining, by elimination, the remaining parts of the components of the argument yield premises. Let's look at examples. As you can able to look at from the screen, here is an example. Women are mammals. This is a premises, of course. It is the first premises, and the never cheat a woman is also another premises. Therefore, the never cheat a mammal. But the question here is that how you can able to distinguish this one and this one is a conclusion, and the other are premises. The answer for this is that by looking at the indicator word that is therefore. As we have said, the statement that comes after or next to the conclusion indicator is a conclusion. So here, based on the rule, the conclusion of this argument, the never is a mammal. This is a conclusion. So by rule of elimination, the remaining two parts of the argument, which are the statements, are premises. If an argument does not contain a conclusion indicator, it may contain a premises indicator. Simultaneously, there might not be expressed indicator words of both the premises and the conclusion. We may have a conclusion indicator, or we may have a premise indicator. If we are able to identify one part of that argument by the rule of elimination, that is, the remaining is the other parts of the argument. It might be the premise, or it can be the premise. If we have a conclusion indicator, the remaining part is the premise. On the contrary, if we have a premise indicator, the remaining is the conclusion. Now we have found some indicator words of the conclusion. Now let's look at some typical premise indicator. There are indicators which are used simultaneously for both the premise and the conclusion. In that case, the most important thing for identifying the parts of the argument, that is the premise and the conclusion, is that looking at other ways of distinguishing the argument. It might be looking at the inferential link, how the argument is constructed and how the reasoning process is going to flow. That's the most important. If we are not able to look at this indicator words. Now let's look at some typical premise indicators. Among some typical premise indicators, since, if there is an indicator word since, as indicated by because, given that here as for, and this listed indicator words, the statement that comes after this word is a premise. An argument that contains any of the premise indicator words are the statements that follow as indicators. Words can usually be identified as a premise. As the same principle is also applied here, the Kelvin point. The remaining part is the conclusion by the rule of elimination. It's very easy if we are able to identify one part of the argument, because we can say the remaining part is the conclusion. But don't forget that part must be a statement and there must be logical relevance to the premise. Let us look at an example here. You should avoid any form of cheating on exam, because cheating on the exam is punishable by the Senate legislation of the university. Here is the example. From this example, you can understand that the premise of this argument is cheating on exam. You see here, cheating on exam. Cheating on exam is punishable by Senate legislation. Here, before this, there is a word because. You see, because. We have said that here, because is a premise indicator. The statement that comes after the indicator word because is a premise. So here, you can understand cheating on exam is punishable by the Senate legislation of the university is the premise of this argument. And the remaining is the conclusion by applying the rule of elimination. Because it follows the premise indicator word because, the statement is the premise. Sometimes, as I have told you before, an argument contain no indicator word, or at all, which means there may not be an indicator word for both the premises and the conclusion. In this case, when this occurs, a reader or a listener must ask for himself a kind of question such as what single statement is claimed? Implicitly follow from the others. Here we call it the not expressed, but the implied statement. We need to ask to ourselves from the given statement the other questions that help us for identifying the parts of the argument is asking ourselves what is the arguer trying to prove and what is the main point of the passage. if we are asking ourselves these questions, they give us the answer to point out for identifying the conclusion. Or asking how the reasoning process is flow within the argument. That's what we call it, the reasoning process or the inference. So the better understanding of the reasoning process or the inference within an argument without looking at the indicator words, both in the case of the premises indicator and conclusion indicator, we can able to know which part is the premises and which part is the conclusion. I think this is a very important concept. Now let us jump to the second lesson. We have seen the first lesson, that is basic concepts related with logic, the premise, the conclusion, and logic itself. Okay, now let's look at technique of recognizing argument. How we recognize argument. As I have told you previously, before giving the truth value of an argument, first we must ask ourselves, is that single passage or that statement has a truth value? I have told you this one, are the requirement of statement. Is that a declarative statement? Because all statements may not contain an argumentative passage. There are passages which lacks argumentation, which are not argumentative. That may be because of lack of inferential link between the premise and the conclusion. It might be also because of the case that that statement is not a declarative. So in recognizing an argument of passage, a passage must contain an argument. And here, in order to say a passage contains an argument, it must be able to purport to provide something for the conclusion. If this is not the case in point, if the argument is not able to or does not able to purport to prove something, it lacks a kind of argumentative passage. So it does not contain an argument. So the basic thing here that you need to able to understand is that every passage that contains an argument must able to give us a proof for something. That is, it must contain the premise that are the evidence or the supports for the conclusion. If we don't have the evidences or the supports that we wanted to prove that is the conclusion or the inference, we can say that it does not contain a kind of argumentative passage. So it is non-argumentative passage. So two conditions must be fulfilled. As you can look at it from the screen, two conditions must be fulfilled for passage to purport to prove something. The first one is that from the argument, at least one of the statements must claim to present or provide a kind of evidence or reason. That is, it must contain a premise. The other expression of this statement is that that argument must contain a premise. The second requirement or condition that must be fulfilled in order to say that an argument or a passage is purport to prove something is that it must claim an alleged evidence, support or imply something that is a claim, something that follow as alleged evidence. There must be something that we want to conclude. That's the conclusion part. The alleged evidence or the evidence that we have help us for making conclusion. So the conclusion follows from the alleged evidence that we have, that are the premises. But most importantly, there must be inferential claim between these two conditions, which means there must be reasoning process between these statements. Without having a kind of coherence or link between the premises and the conclusion, we cannot say that there is an argumentative passage. So inferential link is the most important thing in recognizing argumentative passages. Indirectly, we are saying the two conditions as factual claims and inferential claims. This is the factual claim is the fact of the statement, that is the premises, and the inferential is the conclusion. The inferential link is the relation between the factual claim and the conclusion. But here the inferential can be explicit and explicit. Here, when we say an inferential claim is explicit, we're saying that it's expressed. It's expressed. For example, if we provide a kind of indicator words, that's the indicator, the concrete indicator words, that claim is expressed. If it is not expressed, and that it let us only for looking at the link without looking at expressed element of the passage, it is implicit, it's not expressed. So these two elements or conditions are the most important thing that they help us for in order to say that a passage is able to purport to prove something. So now let us look at recognizing non-argumentative passages. Argumentative passages fulfill the above two conditions, whereas the non-argumentative passages lacks those conditions, those two conditions. Particularly, they lack an inferential claim. They don't contain an evidence or a support that helps us to make a conclusion based on the claim of the alleged evidence. So in general, what makes common to all typical examples of non-argumentative passages that they lack or they do not contain an inferential claim. Look at here the examples of non-argumentative passages. Examples like non-inferential passage, simple non-inferential passages, expository passages, illustrations, examples, conditional statements. Here refers to single conditional statements. Here we will look at the two conditions, the necessary condition and sufficient condition. These are typical examples of non-argumentative passages, and what makes common to all of these examples is that they lack inferential claim. That is why we are saying that these typical examples of non-argumentative passages lacks inferential and they are not argumentative. If passages that lack an inferential claim, maybe statements which could be premise and conclusion or both, what is missed is a claim that the reasoning process is being made. So as I have told you, the reasoning process is the most important thing. If there is no within an argument, simply it lacks an inferential claim. So this all fulfills this lack of inferential claim. For a passage to be an argument, it's not only should contain premise and conclusion, but also a claim or a reasoning. We have said this one. Only containing a premise and a conclusion is not a sufficient condition. It's not a sufficient or not a necessary condition in order to say that it is an argumentative. There must be a reasoning process. So now let us see the first examples of simple non-inferential passages. Simple non-inferential passages is in non-argumentative passages, which refers to a passage, a sort such as warning, piece of advice, a statement of belief or opinion, loosely associated statement, and report. A statement that includes a warning, piece of advice, an opinion, or a belief, a statement of belief, or loosely associated statement, no coherence, and a report are examples of simple non-inferential passage, and they all are an examples of non-argumentative passage because this all lacks an inferential claim. Let us look at examples. For example, warnings. Look at this example. Whatever you promise to tell, never confide political secret to your wife. As you can able to see from this passage, there is no evidence that give to prove the statement is true. Where is the evidence? It lacks evidence. So it is non-inferential, it's simple non-inferential, and it's non-argumentative. The other example is that piece of advice. Example, after class hour, I would suggest that you give a careful consideration to the subject matter you have discussed. The statement also lacks any evidence in order to say this argument. Means it lacks an inferential claim. So it is non-argumentative passage. The other examples of non-simple passage is that statement of belief or opinion. For example, we believe that our university must develop and produce an outstanding student who will perform the great skill and fulfill the demand of our nation. This is a statement of its opinion. It only contains an opinion which lacks evidence in order to infer this statement, this argument. So it lacks an inferential. There is no reasoning process here. So it's non-argumentative. Loosely associated statements here refers to, there are statements, there may be premise and conclusion, but they only stand alone. They are loosely associated. They lack coherence. For example, look at these examples. It lacks evidence. Not honor men of words will keep people from contention. Not very good that are sorry for the deviance. Keep them from left. Not to display what is desirable will keep them from being unsettled of the mind. If we look at this parts of the argument, the statements, they are loosely, they stand alone. You see, this one, and this one. There is no reasoning process. There is no evidence. There is no link. Link is the most important thing. So it's also like the other is that example. I mean, a report. A report is also an argumentative passage. For example, you can look at here the Great Renaissance System of Ethiopia had opened an employment opportunity to thousands of Ethiopians. In its completion, the 30,000 civilians are expected to be killed. These are a report that we heard from broadcasting TV, from radio broadcast, or from other sources. It's a report, but it lacks evidence. But it's a report. The other typical examples of non-argumentative passage is that expository passage. Here, expository passage refers to, it's a kind of passage, and it's a kind of discourse that began with topic sentence. It has a topic sentence. We may have an issue that's a topic sentence, followed by one or more sentences that develop the topic sentence. They only develop the topic sentence. They do not provide another statement that is evidence. Example, you can look at the example. The other is that illustration. As you can look at from the screen, an illustration and an expression involving one or more examples that is intended to show what something means to how it's done. Illustration. For example, in physics or chemistry, how hydrocarbonate, how chloric acid is formed is an illustration through demonstration. It's an illustration. But it lacks inferential. The other is that explanation. An expression that supports to shed a light on some attempt to clarify or describe. Such a light why something is happening and why or why something is what is it. Example here you can look at cows digest grass while human cannot because the digestive system contains enzyme not found in humans. Here, as you can look at, there are two distinct components of this explanation. That is the explanandum and the explain. Here, the cow digests grass while human cannot is an explanandum. It is a statement that tries to show or develop that something that is explained. Therefore, cows digest grass while humans cannot eat the explander part of this explanation, whereas the remaining these parts of this example is that the explain. It's something that we are going to explain. So within an explanation, there are two most important things, that is explanandum and explainis. The other is that conditional statement. The other examples of non-argumentative passage is conditional statement. When a conditional sentence becomes non-argumentative, a conditional statement becomes a non-argumentative passage when there is a single conditional statement. Conditional statement contains if and then clause, or the consequent and the antecedent. We call it antecedent. We call it the if clause as antecedent, and we call it the then clause the consequent. So there is causation within a conditional statement. If we have a single conditional statement, example, if we construct a conditional statement which says if you study hard, then you will score a grade. It's a conditional sentence, a single conditional sentence. But this is not an argumentative because it lacks an inferential claim. We don't know, we don't have any evidence that this guy studied well or not. If we have this evidence, we can certainly conclude that this person scores a grade because of his study hard or other evidence. It lacks something between the if clause and the then clause. If we provide another evidence here, it may become an argumentative passage, but the single conditional statement is not an argumentative passage. As I've said, every conditional statement contains two components or parts, that's the if clause and the then clause. The if clause, this one is the if clause, this one is the then clause or the consequent. This is the antecedent, this is the consequent. In conditional sentence, there are two basic concepts, that is sufficient condition and necessary conditions. In order to say that A is said to be a sufficient condition for B whenever the occurrence or the existence of A is all that is needed for the occurrence of B. Which means A must occur in order to B to occur. If this is the case, we can say that A is a sufficient condition for B. If and only if A occurs, then must occur. So A is all needed. Without the occurrence of A, B cannot be occurred. For example, I may say that being a dog is a sufficient condition for being an animal. If we say that dog is A, and if we say that B is an animal, dog is all needed for the occurrence of being an animal. On the other hand, in order to say that A is a necessary condition for B, if B occurs, then A must occur. Or B is said to be necessary condition for A whenever A cannot occur without the occurrence of B. So being an animal is a necessary condition for being a dog. We cannot say that being an animal is a sufficient condition for being a dog. It's a necessary condition because A is a necessary condition, which refers to an animal is a necessary condition for dog. Then if dog occurs, animal occurs. For example, let me give you a simple example. Suppose that there is a box and there is a dog or cat or other types of animal. In order to say that there is animal within a box, or there is a dog, or there is a cat, if cat or dog existed within that box, we can say that a cat or a dog, whatever a types of animal, is a necessary condition in order to say that there is animal. So being a cat or being a dog is a necessary condition in order to say that there is animal. The vice versa is also true. Here you can look at the example. If X is a dog, then X is an animal. Is a sufficient condition. Being a dog, not being an animal. Being an animal is not a sufficient condition for being a dog. I mean, being an animal is not a sufficient condition for being a dog. Rather, it is a necessary condition. If X is not an animal, then we can say that X is not a dog. It can be also a cat. Therefore, in deciding whether the puzzle contains an argument, you should look at three things. These recommended tips that you need to look at. That is, the first one is the indicator words, like the for, since, because, for, as a result, because of that, as a result of that, looking at indicator words. The second one is inferential relation between the statement that is the premise and the conclusion. They are both statements, inferential, and the typical kind or examples of non-argumentatives. If there the above listed typical examples of non-argumentative passage, easily we can label or call them as they are non-argumentative. But remember that the mere occurrence of an indicator does not guarantee the presence of an argument. Okay, we have said there must be logical reasoning, there must be reasoning process, there must be inferential link between the claims, the two claims, the factual claim and the inferential claim. I think this is our today's discussion. Before we wind up our online class, if you have questions, please, you're welcome. Okay, no question? Okay, thank you very much. Don't forget, staying home. Keep yourself safe by staying home. See you at the next session. Thank you very much for your coming. See you. I have one notice. While you are opening your Zoom room, please don't forget, I want to see your face image. Okay, make it on the image of you. Don't forget this one. Okay, thank you. See you. Bye bye.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ ያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጉታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያድርጉ።